Numéro 13.
Number 13.
Mr. Sorensen.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Honourable Senators, I rise to speak on Senator Klyne's inquiry on the subject of Indigenous businesses and the value they bring to Canada. It's been inspiring to learn about different examples of Indigenous entrepreneurship, and I thank Senator Klyne for initiating this inquiry. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak on a topic I've taken a deep interest in, Indigenous tourism. Indigenous tourism is as diverse as the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities that make up this country. It encompasses everything from interpretive centres at historic sites to major events like powwows, music festivals, and athletic competitions, which attract participants from around the world. Indigenous tourism businesses offer outdoor adventures like hunting, fishing, and dog sledding, agritourism experiences like Mado Aka Farm here in Ottawa, and incredible performances, food, and artworks. Many Indigenous artists in Canada have received international recognition and acclaim. Audiences come from all around to see concerts by musicians like Tanya Taghak, the Hallucination and William Prince plays, and readings by Cliff Cardinal and Thompson Highway, and the stunning art of Kent Monkman and Jason Carter. Chefs at Indigenous-owned restaurants like Pep Pecho in Edmonton or Feast Cafe in Winnipeg craft stunning contemporary dishes out of traditional, locally harvested ingredients. And tourists continue to seek out handmade pieces by Indigenous artisans, including elaborated beaded jewelry, carvings from local materials, and dolls, purses, and fashions made from fur and sealskin. Indigenous-owned shops like Adawa Wig Amig. My staff went over to the shop to try and help me with the pronunciation. In Ottawa's Bywood Market and the Treaty Truck House on the Halifax harbourfront give Indigenous crafters space to sell their creations, act as vital community hubs, and are incredibly popular with visitors from all around the world. Indigenous tourism, of course, creates jobs and economic opportunity in First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities, advancing the goal of prosperity and self-determination. And the visitors these operations attract have a positive spillover effect on surrounding communities. These regional benefits are particularly significant considering over 60% of Indigenous tourism businesses in Canada operate in rural and remote areas. The presence of these tourism operations promotes economic development and investment where it is most needed while giving local businesses a boost. An example of how this works, this summer, North American Indigenous Games brought athletes, vendors, and spectators from across the continent to Halifax. In addition to showcasing the very best in Indigenous athleticism, art, and culture, participants in the Games stayed at local hotels, patronized local shops and restaurants, and experienced the beauty of Canada's East Coast, many for the first time. I'm sure many of those people fell in love with Nova Scotia and will likely go back. That's why I was delighted to learn that next year's Games will be held in Calgary, Alberta, and that the organizers are aiming for a strong focus on artistic and cultural activities in addition to sport. I look forward to seeing what they do and how they showcase the vibrant cultures of the Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda, and Métis people of the region. But the benefits of Indigenous tourism go far beyond the economic. The Indigenous tourism industry is a vital driver of cultural revitalization for Indigenous peoples, supporting storytellers, artists, and knowledge keepers as they pass on their traditions to future generations, including, it must be said, customs that were nearly lost to colonialism and forced assimilation. Additionally, this sector plays a much-needed role in educating non-Indigenous people about the history of this country and all the people who call it home. Learning about the vibrant heritage of Indigenous peoples, including their spirituality, beautiful arts and storytelling, and sustainable way of life, advances mutual respect and understanding. This is the truth aspect of truth and reconciliation. Since being appointed to the Senate, I've had a chance to visit historical sites across Canada, including Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump and Blackfoot Crossing in southern Alberta, Métis Crossing in Smoky Lake, the Indigenous Peoples Experience at Fort Edmonton, and the Mi'kmaq Interpretive Centre at the Fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. Many of these centres are operated by Indigenous people. For instance, the superintendent at Fortress of Louisbourg was proud to inform me that every staff member in the Interpretive Centre was Indigenous. These workers are on the front lines of reconciliation education and are trained to deal with everything, from uncomfortable questions to insensitive behaviour and even, unfortunately, outright abuse. Serving on the Indigenous Peoples Committee, we often talk about the issue of genocide denialism. I find it infuriating, and I can't imagine how difficult it must be to contend with that every day as part of your job when you have a personal connection to that painful history. I applaud the dedication of these tourism workers, and I can attest those efforts aren't in vain. More and more Canadians are opening their eyes to the ongoing impacts of colonialism and discrimination, and these people are seeking out reputable, first-hand sources to help them better understand. A few years ago, I took my mother, then in her 80s, to visit Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump, where we learned about the history of the Blackfoot people in Alberta and the hardships they suffered due to colonialization. My mother was born in 1930, 10 years after residential school attendance was made mandatory for Indigenous children. She was 21 when Canada lifted its bans on traditional Indigenous ceremonies, and she was 78 when she watched Prime Minister Stephen Harper deliver Canada's official apology for the government's role in residential schools. Her generation was not taught about the harms inflicted by these policies. I can tell you my mother was incredibly moved by what she learned by visiting this historic site and speaking to the Indigenous guides, and she spent days after reflecting on Canada's shameful history. Learning and now knowing the truth had a huge impact on her. That's what Indigenous tourism does. And because so much Indigenous tourism is based around storytelling, it's a perfect medium for telling the truth as we work towards reconciliation. I'm not just talking about the difficult moments, although that's essential, but also the day-to-day lives of Indigenous peoples before and after European contact. It's incredibly impactful to hear Indigenous interpreters share their legends and creation stories, explain the significance of ribbon skirts and other regalia, and the stories behind traditional songs and dances, and recount how their ancestors hunted, fished, and farmed, raised their children, built their communities, and adapted to times of change. There's a strong interest in learning about and experiencing Indigenous culture, not just among Canadians, but internationally. A 2021 survey by Destination Canada found that 1 in 3 international tourists want to take part in Indigenous experiences while in Canada. The Canadian government's recently released tourism growth strategy lists authentic Indigenous experiences as an integral part of Canada's international brand, alongside natural spaces, environmental stewardship, and Canada's values of safety, inclusivity, and human rights. Promoting and supporting the continued growth of this sector is good strategically as Canada seeks to attract visitors and grow our tourism industry. Indigenous tourism, like the rest of the sector, took a serious blow during the COVID-19 pandemic. As co-chair of the Parliamentary Tourism Caucus, I tell you tourism was the first and hardest hit by travel and gathering restrictions, and the industry still hasn't recovered to pre-pandemic levels. That's why we've been advocating for strong action to support this sector and to help it not just survive, but thrive. I've really appreciated the opportunity to work with the Indigenous Tourism Association of Canada and other organizations to ensure Canada doesn't lose out on the limitless opportunities this sector has to offer. ITAC is an incredibly strong voice for this industry, and it is overwhelming how much they have done to keep Indigenous tourism on the agenda. The sector also benefits from the work of provincial and territorial organizations like Indigenous Tourism Alberta, Indigenous Destination Saskatchewan, Indigenous Tourism Manitoba, Indigenous Tourism Ontario, Yukon First Nations Culture and Tourism, Indigenous Tourism Quebec, Indigenous Tourism Association of Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia Indigenous Tourism Enterprise Network, Indigenous Tourism Association of New Brunswick, Newfoundland and Labrador Indigenous Tourism Association, and Indigenous Tourism BC. Government investment in Indigenous tourism must continue as it helps communities flourish, stimulates economic development, and creates jobs and careers for Indigenous people. It also promotes environmental conservation, economic self-determination, and cultural revitalization. It helps us learn about our history and allows people from different walks of life to connect and build relationships based on truth, based on trust and respect. I'd like to close off today by encouraging everyone to seek out authentic Indigenous experiences in their home provinces and territories. You will not be disappointed. Thank you.